Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Establishing a Sustainable Aviation Action Plan in Asia Pacific webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Harry Marples, the Event Director for Sustainable Aviation Futures Asia Pacific. Sustainable Aviation Futures, if you're not aware of us, hosts a global series of aviation decarbonisation conferences, bringing together the entire value chain to connect and discuss the capabilities for scaling sustainability across the world. With our Asia Pacific conference taking place from the 4th to the 6th of November at the Park Royal Marina Bay, Singapore, this next hour will give you a snapshot into the discussions and topics that will be taking place at the event, as well as the kind of industry professionals you can hear from, with all of our speakers here today joining us in just a few weeks' time. Our three-day event features over 250 senior aviation experts from across the entire aviation and energy value chain to discuss SAF projects, roadmaps to achieving SAF, and ambitions and expectations for the industry in the lead up to 2050, as well as providing a comprehensive overview of the global SAF landscape and zero emissions technology across the world. Some of the already confirmed companies can be listed here. This is the last week to save over $400 on each pass you purchase, with our early bird pricing expiring Friday, tomorrow. For more information, please reach out to my colleague Nick Cassidy, whose contact details can be found on the screen. Before I hand over to today's moderator, Gabriel Ho, if you haven't attended one of our webinars before, a little bit of housekeeping. You will receive a recording of this audio in the coming days. We will also aim to leave time for a Q&A, so please do ask as many questions as you can throughout the hour. If you have a direct question, we will provide the LinkedIn details and emails of each of our speakers of the discussion. So lastly, thank you very much to our wonderful speakers today, Clarence, Helen, Alan, and Gabriel, for their time in discussing the SAF landscape in Asia. To guide you through the hour, I will hand over to Gabriel Ho, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Asia SAF Association. Thank you, and over to you.
All right, thank you, Harry. Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. It's really a pleasure to be here. I see quite a few of you are online, and really we kept the Q&A polls open, so feel free to pop in your questions. Or really, I just want to say a few words as founder or CSO of the Asia SAF Association. We're a new non-profit independent organization formed here in Singapore, but really to promote the SAF adoption and, let's say, market for Asia. And really pleased to really have a panel of experts who are joining us today, and I'll get them to say a few words. Maybe Clarence, would you be okay to kick off with a small intro?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. Apologies, I think the camera keeps on cutting, the video keeps on cutting off. But yeah, I'd like to introduce myself. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and everyone. I'm the Managing Director of a Global Center for Green Fuels. It is a think tank that advises policymakers around the world on matters relating to the adoption of greener fuels. Over the last, I have about 35 years of working experience in the oil industry, starting with Mobil, prior to it being even before it became ExxonMobil. And then I was in the petroleum additives industry with Ethel Corporation, which is called Afton today, where we formulate fuel additives and lubricant additives for the oil companies. And then after which I had over 20 years of experience as executive director of Asian Clean Fuels Association, where we advise policymakers around the Asia Pacific region, as well as the Middle East and Africa. We've done a lot of work with advising the Chinese government and the Japanese government on biofuels related matters. So very pleased to meet up with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's go with Alan. If you could just share a few words about Airbus and yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Helen Berger. I'm the Head of International Cooperation and Sustainability for the APAC region for Airbus. So this means I overlook all our activities in terms of sustainability at large. And of course, as Airbus, one of the key topics is the decarbonization of civil aviation, and more specifically, the development of a proper sustainable aviation fuel ecosystem. So working with governments, with our customers, of course, but also with potential SAF producers to make sure it happens in quantity and in price that is viable for all the members of the value chain.
Yeah, thank you for that. Last but not least, there's Alan from WFW. Maybe hear a few words from you as well.
Thanks, Gabriel. Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Plitnick. I'm a partner with Watson, Farley and Williams. I'm part of our global aerospace and ESG teams. I do a lot of work on sustainability in aviation. It's a topic that is increasingly a focus both for non-contentious in terms of financing, corporate, but also there's quite a lot of contentious work. We're looking at greenwashing claims and to what extent SAF is greenwashing free or greenwashing proofed. Thank you.
All right, so we have quite a bit to unpack here. So let's begin really with the landscape, and we really see lots and lots of opportunities as there's so much news about SAF in the market. But really, I think we can kick off with this big question: is what is the greatest opportunity for sustainable aviation? It could be SAF, could be something else that you see for Asia Pacific. Would you want to take this, Alan? I think a good way to start. Thanks. And you mentioned
Thank you.
briefly the G word, right? But let's be
Yes.
look at the market right now.
Look, I think one of the things about SAF is that it certainly provides an immediate or intermediate opportunity for airlines, for civil aviation, to reduce their carbon footprint. I mean, SAF itself is not actually carbon free. It's still recycling fossil fuels to some degree until we get more eSAF. I think certainly from our experience with this, particularly dealing with banks and financiers, one of the reasons why SAF is attractive is because realistically, there's another 10 to 15 years before we will have an alternative engine. Helene may have a slightly more insight on this than I do, but certainly as long as we have conventional engines powering most of the fleet and most of the deliveries that are coming until 2040, SAF is probably an intermediate solution. It may be a longer term solution. So I think that to me is where it is. In terms of opportunities, I think part of the challenge we have here is actually SAF capacity. I mean, IATA produced some figures last week which said that SAF capacity in the last 12 months has doubled, but it was still 0.2% of global fuel for the aviation sector. And that's part of, I think, the challenge. Now, some of the issues are, for example, if you want to have a SAF fueled flight, knowing that when you get to the destination or if your flight is diverted, you're going to be able to replace that SAF with other SAF. And that's part of where I think there's quite a bit of caution about when you can't do that, do you expose yourself to greenwashing claims?
All right, I think we'll get into that in detail as well. But Helen, do you feel this SAF still, what Airbus and yourselves are focusing on right now?
Yes, I mean, our entire industry, the airlines have made a big commitment of net zero by 2050, and this goes beyond SAF. I mean, we all know that SAF is a significant pillar, is one we absolutely need, but it's not the only one, and there are short-term, mid-term, and long-term solutions. So the most immediate solution, I know I'm Airbus, but it's actually newer aircraft because they're so much more efficient. Yes, we up to 25% less CO2 emissions. So this is an immediate benefit. And there is still a lot of aircraft that are old generation. So here there is a reservoir of optimization without changing any flight pattern or anything. It's just about using better product. That's kind of short-term solution. There are the mid-term solutions about operation. And I think for APAC, that's an interesting topic on how to optimize the airspace, how to optimize the flight routes. It becomes very technical, but that is also something to look at, because even though it might not contribute so much, maybe 10% of the target, it is still something that is beneficial for everybody, because it's fuel you don't burn, and that's the most sustainable one. That's the fuel you don't burn, and it's cost savings for the airlines. Now, we all know that sustainable aviation fuel is a must. The aircraft that are sold today will fly for the next 20 years or plus, and they have the current engine, so they will need some kind of Jet A1 solution. And so SAF is a must for the future of decarbonization.
Great. I think what we're hearing again from you is really aircraft upgrades to newer fleets that could save, again, 20% perhaps of fuel savings, and even airline operations, probably not the first one, but several airlines have vocally talked about if traffic operations are a little better at most of our very popular airports here in Asia, we could save up to 10%, right? There's a fuel burn. But I think for
And
Clarence, oh, sorry, go ahead.
if you allow me just to complement, to bounce back on what Alan was saying, yes, there are new technologies, more disruptive technologies, but as he mentioned, they're not for tomorrow. We at Airbus, we said we will bring it to the market, the hydrogen-powered aircraft, in 2035. But you see, this is another 10 years before it reaches the market, and then it needs to ramp up. It's not in day one that it will take over all the fleets. So it's still very important to look at those technologies. And we do believe in the long term, they're very interesting, but they will take time. That's a midterm solution.
All right, thanks for that. Clarence, do you have anything to add from the, let's say, fuel producers' perspective?
Yeah, thanks very
all
much.
this comes to play?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important and interesting topic because if you look at the fuel supply side of things, we're undergoing the largest energy transition ever for the last over 100 years. And there's a lot of things to discuss here. For example, the combination of Jet A1 with SAF on its own. I think it's been an achievement to get this sorted out. But I think as we move on from the limits of 50% to 100%, that would be another new challenge which the aviation industry needs to undertake. That's one. But one of the very important aspects to this is that is SAF going to completely replace all Jet A1? There's such a suggestion, for example, in the United States, where moving on to future demand, we are looking at a potential of 100 million tons of SAF if it were to replace all of the aviation fuels in the United States. So that's a very interesting development. And in addition to China, where when I spoke to Sinopec, I think there's a potential for it to replace the 40 million tons of jet fuel demand as well. So this itself means that this whole energy transition is not just a transition, it could be even a replacement of fossil fuels to a very large extent. Having said that, the other aspect to this fuels in supply industry is that the whole dynamics and structure of the fuel supply has changed drastically. In the early days, you have the oil companies producing fuel from the refineries, and then they supply. So everything comes direct from the refinery to not only jet fuel, but in terms of automotive fuels and marine fuels. But with the latest developments, the oil industry you may have a new inclusion of a feedstock supplier or a SAF supplier, which adds to the whole dynamics and the equation of supply. And that's interesting because the oil industry is not specifically, I would say that's not their technology, nor their skill sets, nor their assets. They don't have that assets to produce SAF, particularly with the fact that a lot of them are due to agriculture or PTL and other types of biomass technologies. So that equation has changed the whole perspective of how fuels can be supplied to the aviation sector. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. And I think moving on, I think we are witnessing the birth of a new industry, so to speak, right? Because SAF as a molecule, it's like jet, but to make SAF, it's pretty hard, as we all learned already. And I think what is probably interesting for the audience as well, where do you see to be the biggest impact, right, affecting Asia Pacific? Is it really from the EU, review mandate that's coming along in a few months? Is it just the ongoing, IRA or the, SAF Grand Challenge in the United States? Is it local policies? What's shaping Asia? Maybe over to Helen on this, because you're here based in Singapore and you've seen a lot happening last. So maybe take us through it.
Yes. I mean, the frameworks available in the US and in the EU are established and well known. And it's true that the potential SAF producers, that's the frameworks that they are well aware of and look at preferably, especially in the Europe because of the mandate system. But we see a lot of evolution and progress on the regulatory landscape in Asia Pacific. So it's different from the EU and from the US in that it's so many different states, and that's the complexity. But we can see a lot of dynamism and willingness really from the states to find the solution that is adequate for their economic situation, their feedstock, their industrial network. So Singapore has announced its blueprint last February. Indonesia, during the Bali Air Show, has announced its SAF roadmap. Japan before had announced the 10% target. Korea is also moving. So we see in the region a lot of evolution and progress on the regulatory landscape, step by step, country per country. But especially if we look at the size of the Asia Pacific market and the challenge in terms of worldwide decarbonization. I keep saying we have to make it happen in APAC, because if we look at traffic growth in APAC, it's over 5% for the coming 20 years, which is the highest, one of the highest in the world. It is a very large population, a growing population that is moving towards more wealth and thus more access to travel. And in this region, travel by plane is not an option. It's not luxury. There is no train or limited possibility to use alternative modes of transportation. So if we want to achieve the net zero 2050 target, making it happen in APAC is essential. It's probably something like 40% of the future need for sustainable aviation fuel in the world.
Easily, right?
It is not the situation today because the regulation and are slowly or step by step coming in, but we really see a very dynamic and really proactive stance of the various states in the Asia Pacific, and that's very, very positive.
I guess what you're hearing from you is really growing consensus within Asia to really put in mandates, targets, and one by one countries are really coming, to grips. They have to put in something before this industry, gets the SAF molecules that they want. But really, how down under in Australia, because we've seen Qantas being quite vocal. Why do you think that pressure is coming from, Alan? It's that they're inspired or they want to be compliant, but then we understand so there will be no targets set for now. Do you have some insights into this?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. I agree entirely with what Helene has been saying about the fact that we need to focus on Asia Pacific, and the challenge here, of course, is that we have multiple states. One of the things that I think Qantas and Air New Zealand have done and have done very well is to focus on sustainability and to be very transparent about what they are and are not doing. I think there is quite a lot of consumer focus here on flying greener and on being more sustainable. Australia is one of those places where without aviation, nobody would get anywhere. The distances are too great. It's just not possible to do a lot of these things by train or road instead of flying. Also, to and from Australia, you've really got to fly, otherwise you'll never get anywhere. So I think that's part of it. Now what Qantas has been doing, I think, is they've taken a very proactive stance. They've been investing in their own SAF facilities. They're in a joint venture with a number of European and Japanese partners on a SAF project. And I think part of that is because they acknowledge that the distances that are flown within Australia and to and from Australia create a much higher carbon footprint profile than, for example, an airline in Europe, which flies predominantly within Europe, or an airline that flies predominantly within, say, Southeast Asia. So I think that's where it is. But I mean, one of the interesting things here, of course, is that there is a big consumer focus on sustainability in Australia and New Zealand. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. I mean, one of the things when I do ESG training for airlines is I ask people how much more they would pay for a SAF fueled flight than a conventionally fueled flight. And even airline people are very reluctant to pay more. I mean, we know at the moment that SAF is about a 600% premium on on conventional fuel. So there will come a point where consumers are going to have to put their money where their mouths are. So I think that's an important point. The other thing I would say within this region, and recent moves by the ACCC, the Competition Authority, to investigate Qantas's sustainability, and the Air New Zealand decision on its 2030 targets. I think those are important because they show us that airlines have to be practical and realistic about these goals. It's no good saying, oh yes, we'll get to net zero by 2050 if you're not actually doing things to get there and you aren't taking concrete steps. And to some degree, what happens with the airlines is probably a sort of a test for the broader economy, which is why I think some airlines are being much more focused on this, and why it is much more important in the aviation sector.
Yeah, that's great insight. And I think, again, we want to really stress that some kind of regional collaboration between the aviation industry is needed. So I think here in Asia, plans to a particular view, how can foster greater partnerships or alliances to accelerate this whole SAF market?
Yeah, I think this is extremely important. But in fact, there is a regional airlines collaboration at the moment between the larger airlines here in this region. But I think one of the major problems that that we face is the situation surrounding how the CORSIA and the US grid models should be employed and deployed, because airlines from this region flies to both continents, and we have when I speak with the airlines industry, I think there's a big concern about how the credits will be recognized or not. So I think as a start, there needs to be some form of a G2G recognition in order for the utilization of SAF would be recognized and supported. And particularly in the fact that if, for example, like Indonesia chooses to use its own, but let's say that is not recognized, then how is that going to be sustainably being implemented? So these are things that, and the other issue is that if you look at China, the amount of UCOs that are available at the moment, we have made a rough calculation, about 5 million tons max. Is it able to scale up? And where is this feedstocks going to come from? The availability, the biomass, and all. These are all big questions which the regional partnerships would hopefully be in a position to resolve. I always like to bring across on the table what we call the roundtable meetings and discussions in order for all the various stakeholders to come together to be able to discuss matters relating to the constraints, and then work together to find solutions, particularly with the support of governments around this region. So, and I urge for example, for Southeast Asia, I would urge the ASEAN Center for Energy to provide that initiative to help in bringing everybody together as a start on the fuel side.
All right. Yeah. So I hear you that there's so much more that we can do together. And again, I think for Helen, the regional, role that you're leading here in Asia, what do you see to be, gaining traction or taking off in terms of regional partnerships?
I think this notion of partnership or cooperation is essential because basically we're building a new market. It did not exist so far. So we need, on one hand, the regulator to define like how they want to implement it in the country, what are the kind of legislation, subsidies, mandate, how do they want to progress on this matter? To work together with the airlines, because as Alan mentioned, SAF is today more expensive than jet fuel. So how can they economically viably use SAF? Because if tomorrow the SAF is at the price of jet A1, conventional fuel, the airlines will be more than happy to pay, but they are in a struggle financially. And also the oil and gas producers and the feedstock owners, I think we have to separate those two. they need to work together to see country per country what is the right way forward for that country. And that requires a lot of discussions with stakeholders that are usually outside of the transportation world, like the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Agriculture. We're really bringing in new players into the discussion, and it needs to be a comprehensive approach and not just one of the player moving forward. And we see that happening in the countries. This dialogue is setting up, and we at Airbus are trying to support the dialogue to make sure that they can set something that is beneficial, win-win-win for all three parties.
Yeah, it does sound like everyone's on the same boat or same plane together. And really, Alan, is there anything to add with Australia? Do you see more mutual cooperations between, let's say, Indonesia, Southeast Asia with Australia to ramp up SAF supply?
I mean, in Australia, sorry, Ellen and Alan is confusing.
Oh dear, sorry,
Ellen, go ahead.
My bad.
Go ahead.
I'll let you answer that one, Helen.
Okay. No, I mean, it's well known that we have a partnership with Qantas to help develop the SAF production SAF ecosystem in Australia. As Alan mentioned, it's the aviation has a crucial economic, social role in the region. Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Island, it's a vital link through aviation. And so that's an example of how we partner with with Qantas to try to invest in projects to make it happen, to bring more SAF to the community, to the civil aviation community, and help them make that step.
All right. So moving on here, because we've talked about, again, there seems to be a uptick in demand, but how about supply, and in particular, which feedstocks are you really more bullish about? That will play a bigger role. I see that we quite comfortable with used cooking oil for the HEFA technology. But if we had to kind of step back a bit, and where do you see really to be a next feedstocks that we can rely on to scale up the SAF that we need? Alan, do you want to go first on this? And it could be Australia or just say the regional context as well.
Yeah, look, I think it's quite a challenge on that. I think there's certainly a lot of focus on this. My concern is, of course, how do we define what SAF is? Excuse me. But some of this is about what is available and using what is available. But for example, there's a question about palm oil. Now, palm oil is acceptable to be used in some countries and territories, and it's not in others. So you have a question there about to what extent you can use that. I think part of this is working out how to ramp up the production and how to increase the production, but also to standardize this, because at the end of the day, aircraft engines are designed for a particular kind of fuel, not for these sort of significant variations in composition. And that's the part where I think the engine manufacturers probably have a role to play. But in terms of the sourcing of this, at this point, I think it's a lot more about where the supply comes from than what it is, from my perspective.
Yeah, certainly there's really a lot of studies being done about the potential biomass that's in the market, and really maybe Clarence, do you have some insights into how can unlock all this biomass, or which pathways will be needed to scale up to those volumes by 2030 or 2035 for the industry?
Yeah, thanks. I think this question, you really have to look at it in a couple of ways. First and foremost, you got to look at the four technologies that are mainly recognized here, right? You have the HEFA, the A to J, and then the FT and PTLs. Having said that, if you look at the Asia Pacific demographics, HEFA takes about 80% of the total production market share, with A to J hitting about 15%, and then in fact, you got to add another one, co-processing, which is which Korea is doing right now. So the thing is that, which means to say that the HEFA is where you're looking at the, as I mentioned, the used cooking oils and, tallows and maybe even biomass to some extent, where the A to J is more towards the alcohols like ethanol, methanol. So what is important here is that if you take note of the fact of the availability of these feedstocks and whether it's recognized, that's where the major question sets in. For example, recently we've heard about UCO being fraudulent, that's been shipped to United States and Europe. This is not going to help the SAF industry. And in terms of, therefore, the availability for the production of SAF, we are expecting at least 40 million tons by 2040. Is that even feasible or possible? And then the issues about traceability, certification processes and all. Because ultimately you're still looking at book and claims, you're looking at carbon credits. If you can't have this system in place, how are you going to have the buy-in from all various parties, including policymakers? So I see that ultimately, probably at least for our region, the likelihood of HEFA and A to J probably would become the major production technologies. I think the A to J still needs to scale up, but I understand that Honeywell, Essence should be able to scale up to a large extent as compared to HEFA. But ultimately, the feedstock is going to be a major play here. And as I want to stress this as this is a very important point, I was interviewed by Bloomberg recently. The certification, the traceability is an important part of this whole process. And I think the industry needs to, pull up the stocks in terms of making sure this is done well. Otherwise, all these schemes, book and claim and carbon credits won't be able to work.
Yeah, thank you for that. And really, with Airbus, I think they announced recently putting together another study on technological pathways or feedstocks as well. Maybe making planes a bit harder than making molecules, but do you have a particular view as well? What's next that we can expect from the market to make more SAF? Where it's going to come from?
Maybe to continue on the points that Clarence has developed, in the aviation industry, we have the CORSIA framework, and I think that's probably the only industry that has a worldwide framework that defines what is sustainable aviation fuel, what are the sustainability criteria. So now that we have the definition, as was mentioned, one of the challenges to make sure that we qualify the feedstock, that we qualify the supply chain, and that's a challenge in itself. But at least we have a common framework, common vocabulary when it comes to this. To add to the discussion on the technologies, I think what we need to factor in is also time. EFA is a well-known technology, co-processing also. So this is where we see today most of the projects in the world. There might be EFA, but that's also because it's the most well-known technology. The one, I guess we'll get to financing, where it's easier to get financing because there is less uncertainty. But at the same time, we know that the feedstock is limited. When we look at APAC, there is a reservoir of biomass, a very specific one due to tropical climate and so on. And this is where the technology of alcohol-to-jet Fischer-Tropsch come in. They are not as developed as EFA, and this is where we as Airbus, we're trying to support those projects because there's still valid technology, demonstrated technologies, but there is still limited track record at commercial level to ease access to financing. If you ask for financing, they prefer to finance a well-known technology than an innovative and new technology. And given the availability, the biomass available in APAC, these are very interesting pathways to investigate and to develop. They can also be a bit more decentralized. That's a consideration given the logistics challenge in the region. Now, PTL, again, factoring time, it's still something we will need. When we look at the volumes needed by 2050, we will need the three technologies. But here you need green electricity to make it work, or green energy. And in the region APAC, so on one hand, first we need to still do R&D to optimize the PTL and related technologies so that they're the most efficient. But also in APAC, we need to develop the grid, to develop the access to green electricity, green energy. Because if you don't have green hydrogen or green electricity, the end product will not be sustainable aviation fuel. So time-wise, still, I think we will need it, but it's a second step or maybe third step. First step, EFA, alcohol-to-jet Fischer-Tropsch, and then PTL. I don't know if Alan and Clarence, you agree with this vision?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a very good points. All four technologies or even more coming in on stream will be very critical, because ultimately none of them is going to be able to fill up all the requirements in the near future, or at least in the future.
Yeah, so I think we as industry, we're gonna have to try. And where do you see companies, let's say, starting to put some steel in the ground or just investing in projects? Do you all have some notable examples that you can share within the Asian Pacific region? Alan, would you be able? I mean, we heard so much about Australia with Jet Zero, for example, but who else do you think that's really coming into this industry?
I think from my perspective, Singapore with its sort of conventional refining expertise and capacity is probably a key one to watch. The other two that I think are critical in an international context are Japan and Korea. China's going to be important, but I suspect their focus will be on supplying domestic demand. And given the way aviation has grown in China, I think they'll probably be that will be quite a challenge for them. But certainly, if we can get the Japanese, particularly the Japanese trading companies, the Japanese refiners, the oil importers, those companies involved in SAF, it is going to give us a big jump, a big boost in expertise, in capacity, and then I think that will help to bring down the cost of SAF as well.
All right, we got that. Maybe if Alan, do you have with some insights what Airbus plans to do? Maybe you can invest in a few projects here. Is there anything you want to share? Really?
Yeah, so it's known we have invested in Jet Zero. Airbus is not an oil and gas. So when we invest to step up a project, to having studying it from a technical perspective, saying, okay, we believe in it, it makes sense. We will still need like the traditional large investors. And to follow on what Alan said, that indeed we see the Japanese trading houses, the Shosha, they're very invested into that topic. I mean, Mitsui invested in Nazatec. There are other projects that we see in the world. Mitsubishi HC invested in the fund that we created, the SAFA. So we see them very active in looking at either sourcing the feedstock or looking at SAF plant in itself. And yes, they're traditionally a key player, especially in the Asia region, and now they are very active, and we're looking for their involvement even more. Korea is traditionally a very large refinery market. They send jet fuel to the rest of the world, so it's very positive to see the movement over there and the start of co-processing.
All right. So it does sound like, again, maybe more traditional energy players are building the first wave of plants in Asia Pacific. Not so many new names like in Europe perhaps or US. But really, I think that could rely or all about policy, right? And do you think that's more mechanisms that needed, policy drivers, incentives, or even out of the box a bit? How about carbon markets? How can it all come together, right, to kind of incentivize the industry to really venture into SAF projects? Clarence, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. I think on the policy side, obviously we all know the most mature policies in the Asia Pacific region is coming from Japan and Singapore. In fact, there's been in the past few months, there's been a flurry of meetings between Japan, Brazil, and United States and other countries in understanding how the policies for 2030 is going to pan out. They've made adjustments for from 10% demand for 2030 to changing or tweaking it to 5% decarbonization, which adds to about 10%, in any case. But I think here is that on the policy side of things, that's where the market players would have to play according to the rules going to be set by the government. And for instance, when I participated in meetings between Brazil and Japan, right now the Japanese government is looking at sourcing what they call the global south for SAF. I think they believe that there's going to be a lot of biomass and alcohols like ethanol from Brazil, India, and Southeast Asia. I think this is where the policymakers are playing a huge role in making changes to how SAF can be implemented, because they are way behind all this curve. And I think industry, therefore, is in a position to move along to actually grow the production. And oil companies like INEOS, the Indonesia and others are starting to prepare their plans to build a capacity of about 1.2 to 1.5 million tons. Over here in Singapore, I think that's where they're very lucky to have Neste here to produce the HEFA, HVO and SAF. On the other hand, I think no country wants to have a monopoly or play here. So I think that's where this Asian market, I probably see a sort of a supply hub coming, not from for different countries. So I don't see all the countries in Asia developing their own SAF production. So there could be a supply hub in, let's say, like we mentioned, Korea, maybe in Japan and Singapore, and then supplying to the various countries around the region. So I think this evolution is going to happen, and then that will combine with the major oil companies who are supplying jet fuel. And as I said, this dynamics is going to readjust itself. But policy is critical, because that's where the framework of both implementation mandates, meeting those targets, or you get a penalties, supporting the airlines when it comes to, like in Singapore, where we're supposed to pay some surcharge for that. All these things require a lot of government intervention to make this work.
Right. Thanks for that. And we heard about policies, but to the other panelists, do you think there's a chance that we need to do something like Europe, that there will be penalties in place to really make this industry wake up or start production? Do you have a particular view on this? Is there enough policy, or carrots or sticks, right? Alan, do you take that?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with what Clarence said. I mean, one of the challenges we have here is we have so many stakeholders in this. We have the manufacturers of the aircraft, of the engines, we have the airlines, we have the airports, we have the oil refiners, the traders. And part of this is about how you bring all of those people together and get them to see this as a common objective and a common goal. And it's all fine and good to say that, but it means different things to different people. I think from my perspective, if we look at the Asia Pacific, because we are dealing with so many different countries, it's very hard to get a standardized carrot and stick approach, as for example, you have in the EU. You will never get that in Asia Pacific. What the Japanese do, the Koreans won't do. What the Koreans do, the Singaporeans won't do. What they do, the Thais won't do. The Malaysians won't do. So I think part of this is perhaps to try and find as much common ground as we can. Now, some countries are going to go ahead and impose penalties or impose taxes to make SAF more affordable or encourage SAF development. how that plays out in a commercial context, particularly where people are very sensitive to movements in price, is a separate issue. And I think that's one of the challenges for the region, is how we deal with that. Now, on the other side of that, if we look at the energy market for Asia Pacific, a lot of movement has happened here. Asia Pacific has developed a focus on renewable energy far more quickly and from a much lower base than, for example, Europe or the US. And so we are seeing a lot more focus there. And I think that's something where that will be used in time. I mean, if we look, for example, at wind farms that are being developed in places like Thailand and Taiwan, you can see that for those countries, this is a very new but a very big focus for them. And I think that's where we need to be trying to push SAF, is to do that. I mean, one of the other things I think that's important about SAF is, even if SAF is not the answer, the fact, of course, is that all the stakeholders are now talking about sustainability. And whether we're talking about hydrogen planes or new engines or different flight paths or whatever, if that's part of what SAF brings us, then it has really produced quite a lot, notwithstanding how much or how little SAF is actually available at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great point about the halo effect that's SAF bringing to the ecosystem to drive towards, again, decarbonizing the industries, again, transport or otherwise, right? In the routings of Helen, do you think there's more chances to create a more healthy ecosystem by governments, intra-governments cooperating on SAF projects, or just supply trading opportunities, or even new markets like carbon? Do you all see this harmonization taking place in Asia?
Harmonization, yes, it would be the ultimate goal, because that would make it easier for the airline to operate. It would make it easier for the producers to produce in a homogeneous market. Now, APAC is not the EU. We, as Alan mentioned, we're dealing with many different states that have their own way, their own needs also, and we need to recognize that. And so it's going to be a step-by-step approach. Again, we see some state moving with what fits their need, and their financial capacities and their availability of biomass. And it will, in the long term, hopefully harmonize. But it's going to be a step-by-step process.
All right.
And
I'm conscious that we're about 10 minutes to go and we want to answer some questions as well. So we probably want to dive in the last few questions. Financing, is there enough money in the system? What's needed to really de-risk projects? Maybe Clarence, do you see a pipeline of, let's say, support from the investment community for new projects?
Well, I will answer the fact that at least governments are starting that initiative. So if you look at what's happening in the United States, that's the 45Z is actually a very prime example of that happening. And this is important because nascent technologies and production needs to be supported to give them some room to grow, and then from there they can fend for themselves. But GIVO, I just read today, I think they've got funding about, is it $1 billion? So these are very important for this particularly this type of technologies to happen, because whether you have, as I said, you have two issues here. One is technology and the other one is feedstock. So the feedstock side of things, it's how do you ensure that the financial industry is able to support it through carbon credits and book and claim, because it cannot do so if it's seen as greenwashing or there are fraudulent supplies going around. So these are things that has to be resolved. But the financial market, I believe, I guess I probably trying to answer on their behalf. They will come in if they do see a very strong system that allows them to be sure that they are not part of a fraudulent scheme or a system that creates a problem with greenwashing. Because ultimately today, the money is looking for green energy, but it needs to trust that green energy that is being deployed. Otherwise, financing is going to be very, very difficult.
All right. Yeah, good point about this greenwashing. And Alan, you mentioned it right at the beginning. Do you think this will impede investments or to scare away investors in general if they are seen as, again, greenwashing, or at least the impression of greenwashing?
Not impede investors, but that's a thing that
Mhm.
we as an industry and all the players like embarking into this SAF journey need to be very aware of. We owe it to everyone to be very strict in how we check the supply chain and that the projects fulfilled all the expected requirements, and the financial community will obviously ask for these guarantees. That's something, to be honest, I don't think this is dedicated to aviation. I think this is a question for all the new projects, so-called green projects, or decarbonization projects that come to the market. And we're all learning as we go that what looked 10 years ago might look like a fantastic solution. We know to learn and to check more aspects, the entire supply chain being one of the key learning.
Yeah, it sounds like we do need more green dollars for green projects. And really, just to sum it up, by 2030, which is not too far away, what's your idea of success for the aviation industry? We go around the table to kind of give your, your wish list or sorts, right, by 2030. What's the idea of success? Alan, would you like to go first?
Okay.
Sorry.
If we have a commonly use of SAF across the world in all the regions, a percentage to be defined, but above 5%, that would be even 10% would be fantastic. That would be really the
5 to 10%, you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, that would be to our 2050. Let's hope so.
All right, that's nice. Okay. Gentlemen, what's your views by 2030? What would you like to see? Clarence, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I do agree with Ellen. 5% is really a great number, at least a minimum, because I mean, if you look at all the various Asia Pacific announcements, I only see three very concrete ones. Of maybe you have 4 or 5 coming, or even maybe being announced discreetly. But 5% would be really a very blessing, because to be able to achieve this, you're talking about Japan obviously going for the 10%, then Singapore we're ramping up from that 1% then to 3 to 5%, and that's starting from what 2027, 28, right? So therefore, hitting a 5% would be very good, but 8% would be fantastic. Obviously, we're looking for higher numbers, but let's see how it goes. Yeah.
It's a lucky number. So, Alan, how about you?
I think that's right. I think in terms of this, a 5 to 10% target is a good one. What I'd like to see by 2030 is a bit more certainty about supply and a bit more consistency in what the products are. I think the other part of this is that in the time between now and 2030, I suspect a lot more companies are going to, including airlines, are going to have to look more objectively at their targets and what they can and can't achieve and how they go about doing that. And to some degree, to what Helene said, the threat of greenwashing is probably going to keep a lot of companies on the path to this. Now, my concern, of course, is that some companies will take this too conservatively. They'll do less rather than more because of the risk of greenwashing. That's something we'll need to address by 2030, because if we're going to move from 2030 to 2040 and to 2050, we are going to have to see that that is the case. The other thing I would say, and I think this is to Clarence's point, I agree entirely with him on the financing. One of the things that we see when we talk to banks and other financiers about getting involved in SAF is they're looking at the long-term bankability of a project. They want to know that in 10 or 15 years' time, this project will actually be viable, be making money, there will be demand for SAF. And that's the part that I think the whole industry needs to focus on, is to be able to say, yes, in 20 years' time, in 30 years' time, we will be using SAF. It won't be that these hydrogen engines or these solar engines or whatever come in and SAF becomes obsolete. And that's the part where I think some of the banks certainly are looking at this more critically and are asking a lot of questions.
Yeah, it sounds like you're hoping the industry will be growing up quite quickly by 2030. And I think we
I'm
do
an
have a bit
optimist.
of time. Yeah, definitely. With some questions, we will take them right now with the panelists. I think this first one is like about palm, really. This question is really, how do you see the evolution of the use of palm oil as a feedstock for the production of SAF? Will it continue to be the main feedstock? But is it going to be more restricted to certain countries or regions that, let's say, support the use of palm? Panelists, would you like to take this one? So basically, what we can do about palm oil.
Well, maybe I can take
Mhm.
this one. Unfortunately, palm is a controversial subject, which is really unfortunate. Even in Indonesia itself, I've read reports about the Indonesia's building SAF plants, but and Malaysia as well, but I've not seen the choice of palm oil being a feedstock for SAF production. I know that the Indonesians are looking at the palm oil mainly for its biodiesel requirements. Today is at B40. Is moving into B50 and just announced they're looking at B60 as high as that. So I think that's a domestic policy to support their palm oil industry. But at the moment, I haven't seen even the major palm oil producers suggesting that palm would be the main feedstock for SAF production.
Anything else to add from fellow panelists? Okay, so I think we also want to go to this next one. It's quite important. Given the general, let's say, concerns about sustainability, which has been talked about, converting agricultural waste, municipal solid waste to make SAF. This is very hard, right? As you've seen, and even over in Europe and Americas, this so-called waste to fuels projects have not really succeeded at scale. Do you think Asia can be any different, or offers from the government or industry can work together? Have you all have a take of waste to liquids? So
I think maybe I tried this, attempt this one. I think one of the difficulties of both biomass and waste is that the supply chain in our region is very, very poor. I think there was a study, supposedly Arena wanted to do this study about 2 years ago or something like that. My suspicion is that the collection is going to be extremely costly. And then plus you have the FT technology, it's that's going to add on to the burden of cost. So I think obviously
no easy answers for this, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but of course, if you can do a feedstock, waste feedstock, that would be fantastic, because then you really have generally a circular economy. I think that's what everybody wants. But on the implementation side, I think technology and the infrastructure, the supply chain needs to improve. And unfortunately, Asian market, it's a bit weak in this area. So policymakers probably need to put in some efforts if they think that that's a avenue that they can employ to make this happen.
All right, thank you for that. We come to an end, and really Nick will take over right now. So thank you.